Good evening and welcome to Middle Earth Theater. Yet once again, I'm not Alan Cummings, I'm Seth Meyers, and what I'd like to discuss tonight is JRR Tolkien's epic fantasy work, The Lord of the Rings. I'd like to examine it for what its meaning is, and given that we know that Tolkien was a devout Christian, a lifelong practicing Catholic, what exactly is the Christian meaning behind it? Christians and non-Christian alike will watch the movie and are kind of hard-pressed to come up with something other than, it's a great adventure like Braveheart. There's good guys and bad guys. But the key to answering this question lies with another question, and that I would propose would be what makes a good story. To Tolkien, it was very different than to many fantasy writers. Specifically, I'd like to compare him with C.S. Lewis. Very briefly, with Lewis, when he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, there's Aslan, the lion, son of the emperor. In Narnia, he is Christ, and the allegory and the symbolism are very direct. But to Tolkien, a good story has many elements of faith, awe and beauty, good and evil. But there's not a strict interpretation like there is with Lewis. But to Tolkien, the elements of what makes up a good story, a fantasy, included three dynamics, which actually kind of help us understand how his Christian faith lie behind the story. First of all, there's a recovery, what he would call, to show things how they were meant to be. When you just look at Middle Earth, it's like the hands of time got turned back 1,000 years or more, and there's no, it's a strictly agrarian society, no factories, no cars, no crowded cities. Secondly, there's an sense of escape from danger or peril. Tolkien described it as the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. In Middle Earth, there's Sauron and the minions of Mordor. That's very, very obvious that Tolkien has included that. And finally, Tolkien says in a fantasy, there is a consolation or a happy ending, a joy of deliverance, a defeat of universal evil. And so, with those in mind, I'd like to examine a statement Tolkien made in 1958 describing The Lord of the Rings. He said, "It's mainly concerned with death and immortality." I'd like to make the claim that we can understand The Lord of the Rings as an extension of Tolkien's Christian faith by examining the views on mortality of its various characters. And again, as with Lewis and Chronicles of Narnia, there was one character. In Tolkien, there's several characters where the elements are kind of spread across them. So I think there's three key insights Tolkien brings in Lord of the Rings that will explain this, and they are: the characters live humbly, the characters live sacrificially, and the characters live hopefully. Not all characters do this. Some are bad guys, of course. But first of all, live humbly. Obviously, Frodo and the hobbits are literally a humble race. They're short. They're low to the ground. They don't expect much from life. But you compare it with the Ring of Power, except to enjoy it for what it's meant. You compare it to the Ring of Power, whoever has that has Middle Earth serve them. That's the opposite of being humble. But actually, I'd like to focus just a little bit on some other characters. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, who sat in while the king was not there. And when he got to the end of his life, Gandalf asked him what he had wanted out of life. He said, I wish I could have just handed my throne over to my son, and who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. He did not want to yield to any wisdom outside of or above himself. He's much like C.S. Lewis in his conversion process, where he said, you have to remember, I'd wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. That's the opposite of being humble before, basically, God. Boromir was similar to his father Denethor. He's described as proud and fearless, ever anxious for victory in his own glory. But then you look at his brother Faramir, the good guy. Frodo describes him as a man less self-regarding than his brother. He's also described as an anachronism for Middle Earth at that time, where he said men were slow to believe that a captain could be both wise and learned in the scrolls of lore and song as he is, and yet a man of battle. And so, just like Frodo, Faramir, yields to a wisdom outside of himself. He lives humbly. Secondly, lives sacrificially. I think Gandalf is probably the prime example of this. When he says, none shall pass, and then he gives his life as the Balrog whips around and grabs him with his tail, and he falls into the Middle-earth version of hell, basically. He's very much like Christ, where Christ said, greater love has no man than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. And we're only just getting started, as someone might say from another movie. Tolkien was a scholar. He knew his Dante, so when he describes the hell that Gandalf falls into, it's very instructive. Tolkien says Gandalf was plunged into deep water, all was dark, cold it was as the tide of death. In Dante, at the bottom levels of hell, even though it's a lake of fire, it's frozen down there because the heat and the warmth of God's love is not there. It's dark because Christ is the light of the world, and then he's not there. So between Gandalf, with Gandalf you see living sacrificially. Frodo also is considered by many to be a sort of a priest figure. He makes a sacrifice. He throws the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, but also like Christ, he actually bears the burden in his own body. He's carried the ring, and it sort of destroys him. Finally, live hopefully. Aragorn is the prime example of this, but just in Theoden you see this more explicitly when you see the actual book instead of the movie. The funeral song for him has the lines, "Hope he rekindled, and in hope ended. Over death, over dread, over doom lifted, out of loss, out of life, unto long glory." They kind of miss a little bit of the hope aspect when you see the movie. But Aragorn's a prime example when he describes the end of his life to Arwen. He says, "In sorrow we must go, but not in despair. Behold, we are not bound forever to the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory." Actually, the name given to Aragorn by the elves when he's adopted by Elrond at age 2 is Estel, which means hope in Elvish. He's also a very strong Christ figure. Tolkien has him wandering Middle-earth as Strider the Ranger for 30 years before beginning his reign, just as Christ spent 30 years on Earth before he became involved in his active ministry. And finally, just one other point in this vein is, at one point, Aragorn declares, "I'm Elasar, the Elfstone, and Vinyatar, the Renewer." The Elfstone is very much like how Christ is described as the cornerstone of the church in Ephesians 2. And Gandalf describes Aragorn as a healer. He administers medicines to many, and they are healed. Gandalf says the hands of the king are the hands of healing. So in conclusion, I would say that Tolkien's claim that Lord of the Rings is essentially about death and immortality, it is borne out by the lives and deaths of its characters. And we can see his Christian faith very much informing the meaning of the story. And it's in 3 ways. They live humbly, just as Faramir and Frodo yielded to wisdom greater than their own. They live sacrificially, just as Gandalf and Frodo's actions gave life to others. And they live hopefully, just as Theoden and Aragorn looked beyond the defeat of shadow, dread, and doom of death, and they anticipate and they embrace their immortality. Thank you.